How could you feed a child scraps like a stray animal while your own son eats steak in the same room? And still sleep at night? The words did not explode from anger. They came out slow, calm, and cold, and yet the entire dining hall froze. A silver fork slipped from someone's hand and clinked against a plate. A woman halfway through a laugh stopped breathing mid-sound. The smell of roasted meat and butter hung thick in the air at the long table. Under the warm golden lights of the charity dinner, a small boy sat very still. In front of him lay a chipped bowl. Inside the bowl were scraps, cold bread crusts, a few pieces of dry vegetables, the kind of food that looked like it had been pushed aside from someone else's plate. Across the table, only a few feet away, another boy, clean, well-dressed, and smiling, cut into a thick, juicy steak. No one spoke, because everyone in the room knew what they were seeing, but no one had dared to say it until now. And the woman who had served the scraps slowly lifted her head. Her eyes moved toward the man who had just spoken. She did not yet know that within the next hour, her entire life would collapse with the quiet opening of a single file, and the small orphan she had treated like a burden would become the center of a truth she had tried very hard to hide. The boy with the bowl was named Daniel. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with thin shoulders and careful movements, as if he had learned early in life that taking up too much space could make people angry. But Daniel's eyes held something unusual, a calm, watchfulness, the kind that came from surviving more than most adults ever faced. Daniel had arrived at the Gracehaven home 2 years earlier. No luggage, no family, only a worn jacket and a small wooden toy car in his pocket. The police officer who brought him said almost nothing, just that Daniel had been found sitting quietly outside a hospital after midnight. No crying, no panic, just waiting. When asked where his parents were, Daniel had answered in a soft voice that they had gone somewhere very far away. The officer understood what that meant. Daniel's father had been a city firefighter, the kind of man who ran toward burning buildings when others ran away. 2 winters earlier, a warehouse fire had taken him. A year later, Daniel's mother passed after a long illness that had quietly drained everything the family owned. When the hospital lights turned off that final night, Daniel had nowhere left to go. Gracehaven became his home. At least, that was the promise. But homes are not always kind places, especially when kindness becomes selective. Gracehaven was run by a woman named Margaret Collins, to the outside world. She was a model of generosity. She hosted charity dinners, spoke about compassion, appeared in smiling photos beside oversized donation checks. Her voice was warm. Her words were gentle, and people believed her, because people like believing good stories. But inside Gracehaven, the truth was more complicated. Margaret had a son, Ethan. Bright clothes, new toys, perfect meals, and Margaret loved him with a fierce, almost desperate devotion, which might have been beautiful if that love had not quietly stolen kindness away from every other child in the building, especially Daniel. Margaret never shouted at him, never struck him. That would have been obvious cruelty. Instead, she used something colder, neglect wrapped in polite silence. Extra food somehow disappeared before Daniel's turn. Warm blankets always ran out just before reaching his bed, and when visitors arrived, Daniel was gently guided out of sight. Margaret told herself small lies. He's quiet. He doesn't need much. Some children just fade into the background. But the truth was simpler. Daniel reminded her of things she did not want to feel: loss, fragility, and the uncomfortable truth that compassion cannot be partial. Charity dinner that night was meant to celebrate Gracehaven's success. Long tables were filled with donors, city leaders, and reporters. Candles flickered softly. Plates were full. Laughter drifted across the room. Margaret moved through the crowd like a graceful host. But Daniel had been brought out too, asterisk for appearances. A symbol, a quiet orphan sitting at the edge of the table, his bowl of leftovers placed gently in front of him, across from him. Ethan enjoyed steak cooked perfectly pink in the center. No one spoke. No one challenged the quiet difference. Because sometimes injustice hides best in polite rooms until the voice spoke. How could you feed a child scraps while your own son eats steak? Margaret turned slowly, the man standing near the The end of the table was tall and calm. His suit was simple, his eyes steady. Judge Samuel Carter. Most people in the room recognized him immediately. A man known across the city for fairness that was firm and unshakable. But tonight, he was not looking at the donors. He was looking directly at Daniel and the bowl. Margaret forced a soft smile. "The boy is a picky eater," she said gently. "He prefers simple food." Daniel said nothing, because Daniel had learned something important in life. Sometimes silence protects you. But Judge Carter did not look convinced. Instead, he walked slowly toward the table. The room grew very still. He studied Daniel for a moment. Then he spoke again. "Child's hunger does not lie." The words landed heavy. Margaret's smile thinned with respect. "Judge Carter, you may not understand how difficult it is to care for so many children," but the judge did not argue. He simply reached into the leather folder he had carried with him all evening and placed it on the table. Then he opened it. Inside was a file, thin but powerful. Margaret felt a strange tightening in her chest, because sometimes the quietest papers hold the loudest truths. Judge Carter turned one page, then another. Finally, he looked up. His voice was calm. "This file contains the final wishes of Daniel's father." Margaret blinked. She had never heard about this. Judge Carter continued. "Daniel's father saved 12 people during the warehouse fire that took his life. The city honored him. Asterisk, but before that fire, he also made arrangements for his son's future." The room leaned closer. The judge turned the file so the table could see there. Neatly printed was a trust fund document. Large, very large. Enough money to provide Daniel with education, care, and opportunity far beyond what Grace Haven could offer. But that was not the part that made Margaret's breath catch. Judge Carter spoke again. Daniel's father left instructions that the home caring for his son would receive additional funding each year, but only if the child was treated with equal dignity and care. The room fell silent. Margaret felt heat rising in her face. Judge Carter closed the file slowly. "We began investigating. When the reports from staff did not match the reports sent to donors." Margaret's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. The judge's eyes were steady. "And tonight we confirmed something deeply troubling." He glanced toward Daniel. A child was being hidden and fared, while donations meant for all children served something else. No one spoke, because now the truth was visible, like a stain spreading across white cloth. Judge Carter's voice softened slightly. "Honor is not loud, but neglect speaks very clearly." Margaret's shoulders trembled. Across the table, Ethan stared at his plate, and Daniel still sat, quietly, watching, waiting. Judge Carter turned to the room. Then he said something people would remember for years. Asterisk, true kindness is revealed by how we treat the smallest voice in the room. He closed the file, and within minutes, city officials who had quietly attended the dinner stepped forward. The investigation became official. Margaret Collins would no longer run Grace Haven. The trust protecting Daniel would be placed under new supervision, and the home itself would be reorganized to ensure every child received equal care. But the most powerful moment came next. A woman from the kitchen approached slowly. She carried a fresh plate. Warm steak, steamed vegetables, soft bread. She placed it in front of Daniel. Not scraps. A meal, real, fair. The boy looked at it quietly, then looked up at the room full of adults who had finally seen him, and though Daniel spoke only a few words, they stayed with everyone who heard them. Everyone deserves a full plate. The room stood, not loudly, but slowly, respectfully, because sometimes justice does not arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives with quiet, truth, and the opening of a single file. In the months that followed, Grace Haven changed. New leadership, transparent care, children who once ate in silence now laughed around full tables. Daniel stayed for a time, but eventually moved into a small family home arranged through the trust. His father had left behind a home where kindness was not selective, and where no child was ever given scraps while another ate steak, because dignity should never depend on who is watching. And as Judge Carter once said, a child may be small, but the way we treat them shows the true size of our own heart. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts. Where are you watching from today? And what do you believe matters most when it comes to kindness and fairness? Stories like this remind us that quiet strength often changes the world in ways loud voices never can. Subscribe for more stories that honor the silent heroes among us.